Hello, scholars. Welcome to our next lesson about life in the Plymouth colony. We are today on lesson 6, our final lesson in our look at life in the colony. Today, we will learn about some of the jobs in Plymouth colony, and we will compare and contrast. Remember, looking at how alike and how they're different going to school in Plymouth with going to school today. So we're going to compare and contrast school in Plymouth and school today, seeing how they're alike and how they're different. Let's get started today, first by looking at working in Plymouth. So most people in Plymouth were farmers. They grew corn, wheat, and rye mostly. Those grains gave them the cornmeal and flour that they needed for cooking. They raised cows, pigs, sheep, and chickens. Those animals gave them the milk, meat, wool, and eggs they needed. The family worked from about 4 o'clock a.m. until they went to bed at around 8 o'clock p.m. There were always things to do. Everybody in the family had to help. As we learned earlier in our study, children had many chores. Most of those chores related to caring for the animals and helping with the crops. The men planted the crops in the fields, chopped the wood, and built houses and barns. Women were in charge of the garden and the farm animals. They spun wool to make clothes and bedding. They made their own soap and candles, and they turned the milk into butter and cheese. As the colony grew, there were all kinds of craftspeople in Plymouth. A craft person is someone skilled at making something with his or her or their hands. Some of the craftspeople in the colony were blacksmiths, housewrights, shipwrights, cobbler, cooper, and joiner. You can find out more about those jobs and what they are on the job cards that I'll tell you about in just a moment. Two of those jobs, the joiner and the cooper, have information on this slide. A joiner made furniture. So you can see in that photo a joiner working on a piece for the furniture he's making, and a cooper made barrels. That brings us to an optional activity, making the Plymouth job cards. If you would like to, you could print out and color the Plymouth job cards. The link to those is in this post and is also in the resources on your classwork page. Once you have colored them, you cut out the cards, but you have to do it very carefully. You cut only along the long dotted lines. Don't cut the solid lines or you'll cut the long strips apart and have several little pieces. Once you have them all cut out, use a hole punch or ask an adult to somehow poke a hole if you don't have a hole punch. Punch that circle that's up in the upper left-hand corner of each card. Then put the cards together on a ring or tie them loosely with a piece of string or yarn, as you can see with this green piece of yarn in the photo. That then creates a little job card packet with neat little job cards showing you that a joiner made furniture. Right? The cooper made barrels. The tanner made leather out of animal hide. Right? various jobs that were created by the craftspeople. Now, let's take a look at going to school in Plymouth. The Pilgrims felt that people should learn to read, so education was important. When Plymouth was first established, there were no formal schools through the early 1600s. What that means is that at first, children were taught at home. Parents expected their children to learn to read, write, and add. Mothers taught the children, or they had a neighbor help the children with their lessons. These first schools were called dame schools. The children in the dame school used a special kind of school book called a horn book. A horn book was a wooden paddle that had a piece of paper tacked to it, as you can see in this photo. It had the letters of the alphabet, simple vowel and consonant sound combinations, like what we would call the phonograms, and the Lord's Prayer was written on it. A thin layer shaved off a cow's horn protected the paper. Children then used a hard, sharp stick and traced over the lessons on the hornbook. Once the child learned how to read and write everything that was on the hornbook, he or she was finished with dame school. That, scholars, brings us to our next optional activity. If you would like to, you can make your own hornbook. To do so, you print out and color the picture of the hornbook. It's in this post with the assignment today, and it's also in your resources in your history classroom. Once you have printed it and colored it, you cut out the hornbook. To make it sturdier, you may want to glue it to cardboard or a piece of tagboard. Ask your family for a piece of wax paper to add as a cover. This is easier to find than trying to locate a cow to shave its horn. Once you have that wax paper, trim it to fit over the writing part of the hornbook. The smaller picture gives you a hint of how to staple or tape just across the top so only the top of the wax paper is fastened to the hornbook and can then be lifted up like a blanket. Now, let's continue on. After dame school, boys were allowed to go to another school to learn. Girls were supposed to stay home. Most pilgrims thought it was more important for girls to learn domestic skills than to continue a formal education. Later, laws were passed that stated that any town with 50 or more families had to have a grade school. Those schools were one room buildings. Students sat on hard benches in straight rows facing the teacher. Students were required to bring firewood for the fireplace. Students who brought in the most wood got to sit closest to the fireplace. Students who forgot had to sit in the back. Different age groups all learned from the same teacher. Most of the teachers were men called schoolmasters. Women who taught in a school had to quit teaching when they got married. Teachers were very strict, and they expected the boys to behave. The schoolmasters kept birch branches handy and used them to whip the boys if they misbehaved. And if students did not do their lessons, they were called dunces. Boys had to sit or stand on dunce stools and wear dunce caps. And whispering to friends was not allowed. Schoolmasters had boys bite down on little sticks called whispering sticks to keep them quiet. Have you already heard some ways school in Plymouth was different than school today? Have you heard any ways they're alike? Well, keep listening for more. During a typical day, the students learned what was called the three R's: reading, writing, and arithmetic, which are actually reading, writing, and arithmetic or math. They were called the three R's because they all had an R sound at the beginning, even though they don't all begin with the letter R. Some of the older boys also got to learn history and geography. The students read from a book called the New England Primer, which replaced the Hornbook as a way of learning how to read. First published in 1690, it contained the letters of the alphabet with rhyming couplets, as you can see on the right side of the photo. The book also had prayers and lessons on virtue, along with many questions and answers about God and religion. Students spent a lot of time learning to write neatly. Good penmanship was more important than spelling correctly. They copied their lessons repeatedly using quill pens dipped into inkwells. They also spent time memorizing and reciting their lessons. Formal school ended for most boys when they were about the age of 13 years old. At that time, they learned a trade through an apprenticeship where they were taught by a craftsperson, or they became farmers as their fathers were. Sons of richer families often went on to college. The very first college in colonial America was Harvard University, which was founded in 1636. Perhaps you've heard of Harvard. Imagine, founded almost 400 years ago. Wow. So let's take a look at what we learned today. We learned about some of the jobs in Plymouth Colony. Did you know a joiner was a person who made furniture? Did you know that a cooper makes barrels? And you might have already known that most of the men in Plymouth were farmers. And then, scholars, we compared and contrasted school in Plymouth with school today. I bet as you were listening, you heard some ways that school today is still similar to school in Plymouth. But You definitely heard some ways that they are different from each other. That brings us to today's assignment. Your assignment for today is to open the attached Google form, answer the questions about today's lesson. Remember, you may look back at this lesson, listen to information again, look at the slides in the video. Click Submit at the bottom of the Google form after question number 5 when you're finished. That's what sends your answers to your teacher. Thanks for joining me today. I'll be with you again next time.